Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a really extraordinary, rapid shift in U.S. foreign policy toward Iran. In the world of global diplomacy, things can change in the absolute blink of an eye. And we're looking objectively at one of those exact pinpoint moments today. It's just a perfect example of foreign policy whiplash. We're tracking a sudden, profound pivot from late-stage military planning straight to the diplomatic table. Honestly, it is incredibly rare to see the gears of statecraft slam into reverse this fast, literally moving from the brink of armed conflict to scheduled negotiations in just a matter of hours. So let's unpack exactly what's been reported.
New talks with Iran are set to begin on Monday. That's the urgent, impending news announced by U.S. President Donald Trump, and it serves as our starting point today. A scheduled sit-down, a return to the negotiating table. Now, usually, setting up a high-stakes meeting like this takes months of careful prep, back-channel communications, all that meticulous logistical planning, right? So a timeline this sudden is practically unheard of. But to truly grasp the weight of these upcoming Monday talks, we really have to hit rewind. Because this diplomatic schedule didn't just happen in a vacuum. It emerged from a super intense context just hours prior, creating a highly volatile environment for both nations heading into that room.
Okay, let's dive into this first section, the shift toward negotiation.
We are looking at two completely opposite approaches to international conflict resolution sitting right side by side. On one side of the ledger, we've got massive strikes, the extreme end of military action. And on the other side, new talks, a hard pivot toward diplomatic negotiation. The overarching policy literally went from the brink of kinetic warfare directly to diplomatic dialogue essentially overnight. Grasping this intense juxtaposition is absolutely crucial to understanding the current dynamic. It's exceptionally rare for a nation's military and diplomatic posture to swing this violently from one extreme to the other in such a condensed time frame. Usually, there's a cooling-off period or a gradual winding down of tensions, but here, the pivot was instantaneous, completely bypassing the typical phases of de-escalation. Now let's shift our focus to the averted military action.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific language used by President Donald Trump. He explicitly stated that the planned strikes on the country would have been massive. He didn't describe these as targeted or limited or, surgical maneuvers aimed at isolated facilities. By quoting the president's exact description, we can really understand the immense scale and severity of the military action that was sitting on the table just before the pivot to negotiations occurred. A massive strike implies a broad, highly impactful military engagement with sweeping consequences for the whole region. Understanding the sheer scale of what was almost set in motion really underscores the alternative reality that was averted at the 11th hour, which makes these upcoming talks even more critical.
Let's objectively walk through how this builds into a very specific sequence of events, mapping out the rapid chronological timeline of this foreign policy whiplash. First, we have the extreme escalation of planned massive strikes against Iran. Then, an abrupt halt as the president calls off those strikes at the last possible moment. And now, Monday, a scheduled return to the negotiating table. Narrating this sequence fluidly highlights just how shockingly fast a nation's posture can transition from the verge of conflict back to diplomacy. And this matters immensely on a global scale. A volatile timeline like this creates intense unpredictability. It sends ripples through global financial markets, particularly energy sectors, and literally leaves international allies scrambling to adjust to a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape.
And that brings us to our final section, diplomatic de-escalation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute textbook definition of de-escalation. If we take the timeline we just tracked, that abrupt shift from imminent military strikes to scheduled diplomatic talks, this is it in practice. De-escalation isn't simply the act of having a conversation. It's about actively and deliberately lowering the temperature from a boiling point. The tension was raised to the maximum threshold of planned kinetic action and then consciously reeled back by calling off that action in favor of Monday's negotiations. It is a highly calculated move to step back from the brink, using the immediate threat of force as the backdrop for returning to dialogue. This shift completely reshapes the playing field for the diplomats heading into that room.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a critical, thought-provoking question. What will a sudden shift from massive strikes to diplomatic talks actually mean for Monday's negotiations? Will this extreme backdrop of narrowly averted military action completely change the tone and the leverage at the table? How does calling off an attack of that magnitude impact a high-stakes diplomatic negotiation just days later? It is a fascinating geopolitical situation to watch unfold, offering us a really rare glimpse into the high-wire act of modern statecraft. Keep this timeline in mind as you follow the news and see how these dynamics play out this Monday.